Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to Behind the Veil podcast. Alhamdulillah, today I'm so happy to be joined by Hana. Assalamu alaikum, Hana. How are you?
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. It's super good to have you here. Hana, you're doing incredible work out there. I came across your YouTube channel recently, actually. It kept on popping on my feed. So I'm really happy to have you to talk about what you do. Hana, you are a trauma coach and a physician associate, and you do a lot of work to help women in particular through the coaching programs that you have that focus on helping them heal their PTSD, especially complex PTSD, um, and the effect that it has on women in their lives. So, for someone who comes across you and who wants to know exactly what that means, can you tell us what is it that you do exactly?
Absolutely. So, assalamu alaikum again, and thank you so much for having me, Sumaya. It's honestly an honor. When I first started doing YouTube, yours was one of the first, yours was one of the first YouTube channels I came across when I was kind of doing like my market research and trying to think what kind of vibe do I want to build? What kind of audience and community do I want to build? And so that was last year in June. So it's definitely a full circle moment to come here, inshallah. So thank you so much for having me. For those of your audience members who might not be familiar with me, a few of my videos have definitely been going viral, and so a lot of people came to me through those videos. But I am a PA who practices medicine in the United States, but as a trauma coach, I do something a little different. And so specific to my work as a coach, my job is really to help Muslim women specifically identify the trauma that they have, heal the trauma that they have, and build essentially a new version of themselves after they've healed. I truly believe that trauma robs us of certain parts of our identity, certain parts of our life. And so the healing process is not only just integrating trauma, but it's also building out a new version of who we want to be after that. Whether it's whether it's in our relationships with our loved ones, whether it's in the type of passions or the mission we have in our life, building that out. I think what makes specifically the work that I do unique is you'll find a lot of trauma coaches out there in one way, shape, or form. You'll find a lot of people who do trauma coaching or trauma adjacent coaching. They can't call it trauma coaching fully because they don't have the credentials to do so, but they might make mention of it every now and then. Is that first and foremost, as someone who actually has a background in training in psychiatry, there's that added layer of analytics that a lot of people can't offer. And I think I emphasize that mainly because when you're dealing with trauma, you automatically moved into the realm of mental health. And as someone who sees the worst of the worst when it comes to psychiatric conditions, oftentimes it's veiled to the public audience. It's really important to be able to deduce when someone is going down that path and they might not even realize it themselves. The other thing I think that really makes what I do unique, and I think what a lot of Muslim women identify with, is the fact that this is specifically for Muslim women. And in addition to using the science-based therapeutic tools when it comes to healing trauma, I specifically use an Islamic framework for it. That has been, even just for me, learning and growing through that has been revolutionary, genuinely, because we overlook so often how much our deen, how much the book Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent us, how much the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ has in terms of resources for healing trauma. And I always say this is the biggest failure of our community, is that we have an entire community who's experienced trauma at different levels. Some will have trauma that you see it and you're like, oh my God, that's traumatic. Others will suffer in silence. But because we didn't come to our deen with this lens of what does healing trauma look like, we overlooked a lot of things. And I think this is one thing people catch a lot through my YouTube channel, is that since I was really 15, had, alhamdulillah, a level of Islamic education that many people don't often get to access. It was a blessing. I had incredible teachers. I had a closed halaqah for over 8 years. We studied the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ for over 2 years. I would give halaqat. I would, teach, or I should say, run Quran circles where we went through tafsir of different surahs. And from that, I'm able to kind of extract certain lessons and certain patterns in our dean, and then bring that alongside with the background medicine, the science behind trauma healing. A long-winded answer, but those are the things that I think a lot of people would ideally come to notice in if they've ever come across the work.
MashaAllah, that sounds super exciting. And I'm still curious to know, because everyone has an origin story. The superhero and the villain, everyone has a reason to do what they're doing. So what is it in your life that has led you to want to become a physician, but also a trauma coach?
Yeah, so let me just make a quick correction here. I'm a PA. It's different than a physician in the United States, but we practice medicine. That's just a random caveat. But yeah, so the origin story is I try to be mindful of the way I depict the story. The reason being is that I know some people are very frank about, what their experience with trauma is, but the reality is that I think that everyone deserves their right to their own story. And while my story is my story, it also involves other people who might not want their story fully disclosed. And so I say that because people might wonder, like, why do you overlook certain details? It's out of respect of the people who, regardless of what harm might have been done to me, they also have the right to the Islamic right to their privacy in that instance. So my story is this. I was always a high achiever. I mean, practicing medicine, by virtue, you have to have some type of type A personality to even be able to get through the study of medicine or the practice of medicine. So I'd always considered myself a high achiever, always did really well in school, always had a lot of interest. What pulled me to medicine specifically was that I just genuinely was extremely interested in the human body. I loved the investigative side of medicine. I used to watch a show called Untold Stories of the ER. And basically in the show, they would have physicians, nurses, people who worked in the ER telling the stories of the craziest things they'd ever seen in the emergency room. It was a really interesting show. And with that show, I was so intrigued. Like, random patients come in with these random set of symptoms. You don't know what's going on. And all of a sudden it becomes this discovery journey, right? What labs are we going to order? What imaging are we going to do? What questions are we going to ask? What are the details in this person's story that are going to lead us to make the correct diagnosis, and in some cases save their life? And if we don't do that, it could cause a chronic health condition that basically disables them for the rest of their life, or they could actually end up losing their life because of it. So I found that so cool, and I was like, I want to be the person doing that. That's what led me to it. What led me to the trauma work was an unknown calling from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I actually didn't want. So since I was 8 years old, and I talked about this on my channel, I had depression. It's not normal for an 8-year-old to be experiencing depression, but I'm 8 years old. So what do I know? What's normal and what's not normal? Children don't know normalcy when they're not adults to be able to figure these things out. So I could only go based on what my experience was. And it wasn't until later that I figured out, okay, if you're crying that often, you're that low, and there's, you feel unmotivated, but you're a child, it's just not normal. Couple that with horrible raging anxiety. That was, I had that since I was 6 years old. And again, this is not normal for a child to be, children are scared, children might have their moments, but they shouldn't be experiencing unrelenting anxiety. Not normal. But this is my normal. So I go throughout my years, and right, the thing is, nobody really noticed. Everyone said Hannah's just sensitive, or Hannah's just emotional, right? That's all it was. And that's why she reacts so quickly. And I get to high school, and the anxiety levels just spike out of control. It's like insane. I would wake up every single morning, nauseous, sick to my stomach, shaking, like literally, like if you look at my hand, my hands are shaking. Going to school, and it would just be a repeat every single day. Again, I'm thinking this is normal. I'm not even realizing that this is something that should be managed. And of course, the taboo of mental health in our community, no one even thought that there was an issue, or would have even thought, let's go take her to see someone. And God knows what kind of options were even available at that time. I get to college, and I'm having still some of these issues are a little more manageable. I hated high school, so it definitely didn't help the anxiety. But when I got to college, it was a lot better. Still there though. I would have bouts of depression. It would be very hard for me to get out of bed in the morning. But guess what? I'm a high achiever. This is not a medical term or an actual a term that we use, but functional depression is how it could be described, right? I was winning awards. I was doing community organizing work. I was speaking on stages. I was doing extremely well. I think I graduated with like a 3.9. I did double honors. No one can tell that anything is wrong. But when I was 21, I experienced one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. So here's the thing, and this goes to say with trauma. Our nervous system is really, really adept at dealing with stressors. It's great at it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it absolutely perfectly. We were all born with the capacity to be able to handle stress at different levels. The issue was with me is, and this is what I learned later, is that because I was under this chronic level of sympathetic stress, meaning my nervous system was constantly stressed for years and years and years, that traumatic event, although it would have been hard for anybody, it was at that level, pushed me right over the edge. And so at that point, my nervous system tanked. And I fell into, if I was depressed before this, I just fell into something that I couldn't even imagine. Any sense of joy that I could have ever experienced, it's one of the worst feelings you can have, gone. I couldn't even muster up the feeling of joy. I felt emotionless. I was dissociating all the time. I call it going into the back room of my brain. It was so hard for me to focus. I would drown myself in my work and the things I do, because that was the only way that I felt like I could get through things. I cried all the time. I felt like my body was betraying me. I was getting nauseous all of a sudden, and I didn't have any GI diseases to constantly have bouts of nausea to the point that sometimes I threw up. I started getting numbness and tingling in my arms and my thighs, and it was just really, really weird. And nothing made me laugh. I didn't want to see people anymore, because it was like, why would I want a reminder of how little joy I feel when I'm in a situation with friends and people that I actually want to be around and I can't feel anything? It was miserable. It was absolutely miserable. Fast forward a few more years, another traumatic event hits. And it was like, shoot. So now I'm in this situation where I was already at my low. I was kind of coming out of that, but it was still really bad. And then I get hit again. And once more, the issues that I experienced when I was 21 deepened. I actually developed a migraine disorder now. And so now it feels like my body's betraying me. My mind is betraying me. All throughout this, my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is maintaining some sort of stability. I had a rule to myself, and this is why I'm really passionate about the connection between trauma and our faith, that no matter what happened with me, it never meant that it was okay for me to deny the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has a right to be worshipped by me. So I made all my salah. I would do extra. I would read Quran, every single night. I would still try my best to hear, yeah, Allah, if anything throughout this time, if you can see that I'm still trying to be a good Muslim and still trying to worship you, then I pray that at least if I can get reward out of this horrible time in my life, that's all that I can focus on right now. Now I realize depression, anxiety. This is depression, anxiety. Depression, anxiety are symptoms either way. They're not disease processes. They're not mental illnesses. They're symptoms. And it takes a certain criteria for them to be diagnosed as mental illnesses. There's a really important distinction. So, but technically at this point, it was mental illnesses for me. I met the criteria. And so I was like, let me try the things that we're supposed to try for depression, anxiety. It wasn't working. It was maybe temporary relief. I even go as far as getting on medication. At the end of it, subhanAllah, I almost felt like I was going to give up. I was just like, I don't know what to do. I got to a point where I was having the thoughts that, I won't say a Muslim should never have these thoughts. A Muslim should never follow the action that follows the thoughts. But the reality of it is at a certain point in time, our brain starts seeking one way out. And I was at that point. I had a mentor who she herself is a therapist, actually. And she brought up to me, talking on trauma. She started talking to me about trauma. And I'm like, okay, trauma. Like, we know PTSD, soldiers, right? Trauma. Okay, what are you talking about? And she starts describing it to me. And the medical brain starts saying, wait a minute, this makes a lot of sense. That there is actually a system in our body that is meant to be able to deal with this. And when there's insult to that system, it can no longer handle what it needs to handle. But that if Allah created the system, there's got to be a way to reverse engineer the system. And that started my journey. And I was like, subhanAllah, Like it took that one conversation to open up this world to me. I actually had worked with a mental health professional who was also trauma informed, though she never made it super clear that she was. She mentioned, she's like, yeah, this might be trauma, but she never like dove deep into it. And I'm someone, I need the research. I need you to tell me so I can go deep dive. So I did a deep dive and I started my journey of healing. I spent so much money, like I didn't even know how much money I spent on it, but it was worth every dollar, because at the end of the day, if it got me to where I was and rid me of all of this pain, inshallah, for the rest of my life, then it was worth every penny. I went through a trauma group coaching program, actually run by a non-Muslim, learned a lot, but I remember leaving that program saying I needed more, and I want something that integrates the fact that I'm a Muslim. Like I didn't like that I had to explain, like, this is why I think about things the way I do, because I'm Muslim, to this group of non-Muslim women. And so I decided to build it. And when I finally got to a point where the migraines were gone, the nausea was gone, the numbness and tingling had stopped, I could finally handle stress. I didn't feel like I was constantly just breaking down. My energy was coming back. All of these issues I had were dissipating. I realized, okay, I did it. The trauma, Allah did it, but he allowed me to find the ways to do it. I should say it like that. The trauma has been integrated. I'm doing okay now. How can I build this out so that other Muslim women can access that? And that's an origin story. That's what I've been doing since 2021.
Wow. SubhanAllah, it sounds like you've been through so much, and I'm glad that Allah gave you not only an exit from your pain, but also a beautiful way to share the lessons that you got from that pain. Thank you for sharing that with us, because I'm sure that a lot of the sisters that will be listening to this episode will be relating to many of the symptoms that you mentioned. And I want to slow down on some of the things that you said so that we can go deeper and understand better. You said anxiety and depression are symptoms. So for someone who's struggling with similar symptoms and things that you also mentioned, what could be the source of depression and anxiety then, if those are just symptoms?
Let's talk about anxiety first. Anxiety is an alarm bell in our brain. That's what it is. And so essentially our body will generate the experience and feeling of anxiety. Our nervous system will generate that feeling to warn you that something is wrong. That also doesn't always mean that something is actually wrong. So it gets extremely complex. And this is why working with someone who's informed and educated on these things, whether it's a mental health professional, a psychiatrist, someone who truly, a trauma coach who has the credentials, is really, really important. It can be sourced from a lot of different things. It can be a single experience that you had that triggered, that taught your nervous system, this thing you have experienced is so harmful and dangerous to us in our survival, us being you and your nervous system, essentially, that anytime you're exposed to it again, we're going to rile up the feeling of anxiety. So, don't come near it. Think about fear, right? The phobias. That's actually, phobia is a type of anxiety. It lends itself to anxiety. And obviously at a certain point, it becomes a disorder. It might be that. There's another, aspect of anxiety that might be more so that, I'll use social anxiety as an example, right? It's that the potential of harm is there. It's not, maybe you've never actually experienced it yourself, but you saw someone else experience it. With social anxiety, it's the fear of humiliation. And because we are social creatures and it's embedded in our nervous system to connect to people, this is co-regulation. It's a really important part of trauma healing also. That when we see something that might potentially take that ability away from us, even if it's not us, some people will develop social anxiety because of that. If you're a example practicing Muslim woman in a Western country and you wear hijab and you know that other people have experienced, maybe you've never actually experienced it directly, other people have experienced Islamophobia, it's a threat to your social integration, you might feel social anxiety. So there's lots of different ways, and that's why it takes a while to break down where it comes from. When it comes to depression, the conversations even around these are very mechanical, and we needed criteria. I mean, the medical community needed criteria so we can offer some sort of solutions to people who are struggling. But there are so many different types of depression. I actually have a video on my channel. It's one of my older videos, so sorry if that the lighting is not the best, but it was called the 7 different types of depression, because you can be told you have depression. It can go as far as to be diagnosed as major depressive disorder, for example. Source of that needs to be investigated. That's where people working one-on-one with someone, you might find this in therapy. We're trying to unlock that source. Depression might come from burnout. You're just so burnt out that your nervous system is like, we can't do this anymore. We're bringing you into a low to protect your energy. When I say energy, I don't mean protect your energy like new agey vibes stuff. I mean protect your sympathetic energy. Depression might be after a really horrible event that truly made you sad. A loss of someone you love can cause depression. Usually it's a short-lived one. We call it grief. But if it prolongs beyond that, you can be experiencing that for a very long time. Depression can be because of a life. It's an interesting concept. It's called ambiguous grief, meaning it's not what you lost, it's what you never gained that causes depression. It's the dream you never got to achieve. It's the life you think you're never going to have. It's a sense of hopelessness, right? And so there are different types, and it's helping people identify those different types where you can actually build out a plan to overcome those different types.
Wow.
Yeah.
SubhanAllah. There's another thing that you mentioned that I want to spend some time on. You said you used to dissociate.
Mm-hmm.
Dissociation, what is it and how does it manifest itself?
Yeah. So dissociation is a protective mechanism of our nervous system that is experienced by a lot of individuals who've experienced trauma, where in the simplest non-scientific terms that I can explain it, it's that your brain basically says, this is too much for us right now. We do not have enough sympathetic energy. We don't have enough energy in our nervous system to be able to help you through it. So what's going to happen instead is we're going to shut down. There's a whole theory on this and how it happens and why it happens. And it's also in the same realm of things like feeling numb, right? Freezing, and your brain shuts down. So you stop feeling the emotion associated with it. That's actually a really ugly place for your nervous system to go. It's almost a last resort, right? It falls in line in the same realm of symptoms that we see people who are having unaliving thoughts. That's usually, you'll find that they're experiencing that too. So it's a protective mechanism so that you don't feel the pain or the fear or the difficulty that you are experiencing in that time. Survivors of abuse especially often will disassociate. You'll hear people in the moment of being physically abused, for example, they'll say, I don't even remember what happened. I feel like I was watching from a corner, or I feel like I left my body. That's disassociation.
That sounds familiar. Is maladaptive dreaming a form of dissociation?
Yes. Yes. Like daydreaming.
Yeah.
Yeah. So daydreaming is daydreaming is a little complex. It can be. It's specifically if you're doing it as an escape method, and we do see that a lot in disassociation. There's another type of daydreaming that's not maladaptive at all. It's actually very adaptive and it's very healthy. And it's a type of visualization which actually helps you build connections in your brain and helps you build out a plan for things you need to do. So it's one thing that can be used for protection. It's another thing that can be used to actually help you thrive.
Okay, yeah, that's something that I use a lot myself, and I recommend my clients to visualize their future goals and things like that. But when I still had TikTok, because I don't have socials on my phone anymore, I was telling you at the beginning before we press record. But when I used to have TikTok, I would see a lot of these terms thrown out in very short form content, maladaptive dreaming and anxiety and ADHD. And I'm curious to know, what is your opinion on mental health being so talked about on social media, but at the same time, people overusing labels to now self-diagnose?
Yeah. So it's a catch-22, right? The more we speak about something in the greater scheme of things, the more research funds those topics, right? Which is really important. I mean, coming from me, who as a medical provider, what I'm basically allowed to do has to align with research. I can't just sit there and be like, I think this might help you and not know if it's backed up by research. That's dangerous. And so it funds the research, and it means that these things become more accessible to everyday people. It changes the methods through which we practice the different modalities, what's become more accepted and what's considered what's not accepted. Obviously, it allows for people to feel more comfortable coming forward with what they're dealing with. There are a lot of people who are going to live in a world where they don't even realize something's wrong, like how I lived in that world for a very long time. And so when we constantly hear about it, it builds a connection. Like maybe there is something that's going on. Now, there's another side of it that's actually very complex. And I say this is my personal opinion. And obviously, there are going to be people who are going to feel very passionate about it. And it is what it is. We have different lived experiences. We work with different type of people. I think it's very easy to use the conversation around mental health as a crutch and not a tool of empowerment. And I say this knowing full and well that when someone is experiencing depression, anxiety, and I mean, from myself and my patients and my clients, I think I have a very distinct experience that a lot of people are not going to be able to have because you need a medical degree to have it. Depression will leave you unmotivated and unable to just do even sometimes a normal basic daily functioning. That's not what I'm not shaming anyone for that. But what I'm saying is that part of what allows for these things to continue is if we accept the label without believing there's a way out. And coming to that from the perspective of a Muslim is to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ told us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for every disease, he sent a cure. Mental illness, whether at a certain point, if you have depression for long enough, it's going to qualify as a mental illness. It only takes 2 weeks by the criteria we use for major depressive disorder. There's a cure for it, meaning there's a way out, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Even in the Quran, there's a verse that says, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Man yattaqillah yaj'al lahu makhraja wa yarzuqhu min haythu la yahtasib." For you, and basically it translates to whoever has taqwa of Allah, he will make for that person many ways out of their calamity or their difficulty, and will grant that person rizq or sustenance from places he or she would have never imagined. That's healing. That is what healing is. Healing trauma is possible because of these things, and Allah, out of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. We focus so much on the labels and not the what comes from that. I ask this question a lot, actually, because I'll hear people, maybe this is why some people like don't vibe with me as much. You'll get a very practical side of things. And I've just always been like this. Maybe it's a coping mechanism. Maybe it's just the way I am. I'm very like, okay, so what next? So I'll hear these conversations and like certain labels put out, and I'm like, okay, so you said this. What's the purpose you were trying to achieve? But like, what's next? So what are we working towards, right? And now people are aware that they have depression or anxiety. What's next? Am I just planning on leaving them with awareness so that they mope and feel hopeless? Or am I bringing that awareness so they know, hey, you're dealing with this. You can investigate where it comes from. There are potential solutions. We can find something that uniquely works for you. And there are options for healing for everyone.
If someone is listening and realizing that what they've been through is actually trauma, that it's not something that was normal and healthy, what are some of these options when it comes to healing?
Very good question. So, okay, there is, let me preface by saying the world of trauma is still being researched. Like we are just now, maybe in the past 2 decades, coming to terms that complex PTSD is actually a thing, that it is, and the modalities of treatment are still being explored. It's fairly new. And part of the reason was because, I mean, there were kind of like political reasons, and that the American Psychological Association didn't want to accept complex PTSD as a diagnosis. And if you don't have a diagnosis in the manual that we use to diagnose, then no one's going to fund that research. No one's going to care to look into it more. This is why I'm very, where many of us are very critical of the medical system, because at the end of the day, it is operated by human beings. And there are people who are traumatized, who are not like survivors of war or soldiers or veterans, right? And they were ignored for a very long time. So it's still new. So I'm going to throw out a few options. I'm also going to obviously plug my my option in here. But first and foremost, if you are, let's say you don't want to work with a coach, you want to work with a therapist, that's fine. Find someone who is trauma informed. You can look up, when you're looking up, find someone who is trauma informed. This is so important, you guys, because I'm going to tell you right now, trauma has to be treated very differently than depression, anxiety, or anything else. To sit with someone who's just a basic, and when I say basic, I don't mean it as an insulting way, but
I feel offended.
In the sense of their training is the typical training you get for a therapist or a counselor. They may, if their program was advanced enough to even introduce a module on trauma, their training is very limited in that. And it may be that they use a modality that is actually harmful for you. For example, talk therapy. You would think talk about your trauma, that helps, right? Most people would say, yeah, talk about your trauma, tell your story, let people know. If what you're dealing with is truly trauma and you have not done the integration and the work around it yet, and you talk about it, you actually further traumatize yourself, you re-traumatize yourself, you worsen your nervous system dysregulation. Why? Because you're bringing back up all of the it's our brain, our nervous system, which our brain is included in our nervous system, is connected to every organ, every bit of our body. You are bringing up these physiological responses that now your nervous system says, oh no, danger, 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 push it back down. So you're bringing it out without being able to integrate it by telling that story, and then you end up in a worse off situation. I've had people who left therapy altogether because they came in thinking that they were going to work through it by talking through it, and only ended up further traumatized. And you have to work with someone who's trauma informed that knows, no, you don't actually have to tell the details of your story. That's probably one of the most incredible things about trauma healing, and maybe a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because retelling the story of your trauma is ironically traumatic. So it's very important to know that. There are a lot of people who might be trauma informed. If you're working with someone, I want you to nitpick a little bit, like question their credentials. You should, because why are you going to put the time and the money to not know if this is going to be further harmful for you? So ask them, okay, you're trauma informed. What does that mean? Where did you get your credentials? What modalities do you use? How would you deal with this specific situation? Not to put them on the spot, but just to make sure it's a good fit. So that's option number one. If you are going the medication route, please know that we really don't have a lot of options for medication for PTSD in general. We might treat symptoms associated with it. So some people might find themselves wanting to go on certain medication. I prescribe the medication. There are people that are like, just give me it. And sometimes it does help get you to a point of actual functionality where you can do the other work. And then if you want to get off, you can get off of it, you know? So just make sure you're working obviously with someone who has a medical degree. Obviously, I don't think anyone would seek like psychotropic medication from someone who doesn't have a degree to prescribe it. I'd question a lot of things if anyone did that. There are trauma coaches who actually have the credentials to be able to help you in that way. When I first launched, it was the first trauma group coaching program for Muslim women. Since then, I saw one other one in Mela Basra. I'm sure she's doing amazing work. So then now I have to say my trauma group coaching program is the only group coaching program for Muslim women with trauma that is led by a medically licensed and nationally board certified professional. And I use multiple modalities, not just, usually I'll find people doing like somatic sensory processing. We do that, and we do multiple other modalities because from my experience, I was actually I worked with a somatic coach, and I was kind of frustrated. I was like, I need more than this. That's why I brought it into the program, alhamdulillah.
SubhanAllah, the next question on the list is, what do you think about somatic work to heal? Because when I was struggling with self-sabotaging tendencies, my business coach advised me to do somatic work. And for her, she was adamant that that was the missing piece in my inner work. So I'm hearing that you do that in your program. So I'm guessing it is one of those modalities that work and that's necessary.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I think it's a missing piece in a lot of our self-work, especially trauma work. The way I describe it is that it's reverse engineering your nervous system. Your nervous system is connected to every organ in your body, and trauma lives in your body. And so if you want to heal your trauma, you have to reverse engineer your nervous system. You have to do it through your body. A piece, but not the whole piece. And sometimes people sell it as if it's the only piece. And I think it's interesting because they'll sell it as that, knowing that people are also going to start exploring other options. And so it becomes like this bias effect, like, oh, you only did somatic sensory processing, but in reality, they also did a bunch of other things that helped to further the impact.
Okay. And just for people who don't know what somatic work is, can you explain briefly what it consists of?
Yeah, somatic sensory processing or somatic work, it has different names. It's basically a set of different techniques and processes that help you connect to your physical body in a way that helps bring back safety to your nervous system. And in the case of trauma, helps to integrate the trauma.
Next question I have for you, Hana, is how do you incorporate spirituality in the work that you do, or how can someone who wants to do this work on healing can incorporate spirituality in this?
Yeah, very good question. So I think it takes a keen eye to be able to. It's very, it's interesting. I remember when I was growing up, there are so many like lectures I listened to on patience, and no one mentioned trauma when it came to the patient side of things. So it's like, what are we being patient through, and what does patience actually mean? It takes a keen, critical eye to be able to look at these verses, look at the hadith, and really see the connection. When I say critical, I'm not saying that you critique Allah's word, or the nor am I saying that you interpret it. The Prophet ﷺ said, he who interprets the Quran, let him take his seat in the hellfire. That's meant for the scholars of the Quran who have the years and years behind them in the education to be able to interpret the verses of the Quran. So I just want to clarify that, so no one clips this and says, Hana is telling people to interpret the Quran. It takes a really keen eye. Can you do trauma work on your own? Yes. I mean, I think it would be very dishonest of me to say that someone can't do that on their own. It is going to take much longer. If I can give you a few guarantees, it's going to take much longer. You are at higher risk because you might re-traumatize yourself. You probably are going to re-traumatize yourself because you don't fully know the pathway. This is why working with someone is helpful. Yeah, I'll give you two main like examples of the way I integrate spirituality and deen into my work, right? For anyone. First and foremost, dua. Let's talk about dua, right? Oftentimes we think about dua as a way to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for things that we want. The reality is that dua is not, and if I did a whole 30-day series on Quranic dua on my channel, if anyone wants to watch that, it'll give you a very different outlook on what dua is actually, based on the dua from the Quran. Dua is not asking Allah for something. Dua is calling out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that might mean that you ask for something. It might mean that you just are venting. How do we use dua for the healing of our trauma? Remember earlier on when I said that you don't need to specify the details of your story to heal trauma. In fact, it could re-traumatize you. Well, isn't it incredible that when we call out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our pain, we don't have to tell him what's going on because he already knows. So can dua be a tool of healing trauma? Absolutely, for two reasons. One, you get to actually bring up the emotion without accounting the actual event. So you slowly basically re-expose yourself to the stressor, but then you're doing integration of some sort because you are actually doing an action around it that helps to integrate it. So that's the power of dua. Not only that, dua is an action. When you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you consult him, you bring these things up to him. He, by virtue of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way he built dua out, he mandates a response on himself. He literally basically, there's a whole hadith, Allah is shy, and not shy in the way we're shy, but shy that when a believer puts his or her hands up to allow them to bring those hands down and he has not given them something, right? So action happens. You literally are changing the connections in your brain. You are changing your destiny. Dua changes destiny. That is trauma. That is one piece of trauma integration that a Muslim has access to. That's one. Two is your salah. And your salah, I mean, we're talking about somatic work. Your salah, the fact that there's a meditative quality when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the Prophet ﷺ how he should be reciting Quran in tahajjud. This is in Surah Muzammil, وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا, right? So recite the verses of the Quran in measured recitation, slowly, calmly. Don't rush through it. Do it in a beautiful voice. Why? That actually triggers our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calming, safe side of our nervous system, right? So there's like that meditate, and it sends you into the brain state that is the meditative brain state where a lot of healing happens, where your brain is the safest to be able to heal. And then there's the physical movements of salah, obviously, and you can prolong your sujood. And there's something about sujood that I still can't explain it to you guys. I don't even have a scientific theory behind it, other than I know I've experienced it and I know other people who've experienced it. I've had times when I stepped into salah so anxious, and when I went into sujood, it was like the tightness in my chest completely was gone, despite the fact that physically you are actually like your rib cage is kind of contracted a bit more. So you should feel more tightness. This is the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's in that you're technically, if you're intentional, you maintain khushu' and you're mindful of recitation, you're basically doing the meditative side of healing, and you're also doing somatic work and salah. So those are just two very common things we do that help to integrate trauma from an Islamic perspective. There's much more than that, and it's kind of that's why I say I use an Islamic framework. You get the scientific side, but you also get the integration of, as a Muslim, how do you heal?
SubhanAllah, it's so beautiful. When it comes to dua, I feel like it's such a huge emotional release as well. And that's what you kind of said as well. It just allows us to surrender to the things that we don't have control over, even if we keep on thinking that we do have control over everything, subhanAllah. So dua is a reminder that we don't, and that Allah is in charge, and that He's literally the best in charge. He's the best of planners. He's the best wali and protector and guardian for us. So alhamdulillah for that. Last question for you, Hana, is it truly and really possible to fully heal from trauma? And the reason why I'm asking that is because I'm putting myself in the position of a woman who's done a lot of work on herself. She feels like she's definitely not the wounded woman that she used to be, but she still can't fully feel joy and experience deep contentment with this life. What would you tell that woman? Is it really possible to get to a point where she is fulfilled?
So the way I answer this question is kind of twofold. First, healing is a non-stop journey. I don't think there's ever fully a point where you can press a button and say, I'm healed and I never need to do anything else. The other thing I say, and I say this to my clients, is I want you to treat trauma like you treat alcoholism. That you understand that someone who was an alcoholic, when they find sobriety, they should never pick up another drink ever again. I don't care if you've been sober for 40 years. Why? Because the patterns are so deeply ingrained in your brain that the trigger is this quick. And in fact, there's a book, if you guys are interested, it's called Dopamine Nation by Dr. Anna Lemke. She is an addiction psychiatrist. And she talks about it. It takes, I forgot what it was, like within a week. I think it was a week that it took for people to fall right back into the addiction despite decades of sobriety. So they don't touch alcohol. If you have been traumatized and your brain has learned those patterns, you don't ever get to not do the work because your brain is going to default to those patterns. Now, there's going to be a time where it doesn't have to be as much work. It's going to be a time where you have a lot more leniency. Things get a lot easier, but that work never ends. And guess what? This is a dunya. Trust me, when I came to that realization, I was like, oh man, are you telling me I'm never going to be normal? And I'm just like, it's the dunya. Like, alhamdulillah, that we have access to the things that to help us, but perfection was made for the akhirah. So we all have to have a test. At least this is a test that becomes manageable once you are doing the healing work.
Absolutely. I think it's all about reframing the purpose of this life and remembering that we're not supposed to have an amazing time here. Otherwise, we won't be yearning for the afterlife and for Allah's closeness and proximity in the afterlife, subhanAllah.
I'm going to throw one more thing, and then maybe this might be specific to you and to others who share the same feelings that you were mentioning, right? Joy is an experience. It's not a thing. And gratitude is one of those things that brings joy. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that if we are grateful, He increases us. But often what withholds our joy is a deep-seated fear of something that either we don't recognize or we don't want to admit, right? Because it's us who allows ourselves to feel the joy or not, right? Sometimes you'll feel it start to muster up, and then we shut it down. And a lot of times, and especially for a lot of my clients, it's like, you don't want to feel that joy because it reminds you of the potential of disappointment, or it may very well actually lead to disappointment. So you withhold it. And that's why part of the healing journey is a vulnerability to say, even if it fell flat on its face, at least I allowed myself to have the right to try. And then learn how, if things do fall apart, well, what are the pieces of joy that still exist? SubhanAllah. They're still there, and that's something I really had I'm gonna get emotional about it, actually. I had a hard time learning this because I felt so little joy for so long that when the healing started and I was like starting to feel the inkling, I was scared. I was like, I don't want to feel these things. And then I realized, like, if I'm doing that, I'm withholding myself from being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And why would I do that? Why would I do that to myself? And why would I disrespect Allah for that when He's given me, despite all of this, He still keeps giving me goodness, in my health, my friends and my family, in the fact that I get to do this work that a lot of people don't get to do. So maybe question yourself, what is it that you're scared of and why?
Yeah, and that was very powerful for you to share. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was such an interesting conversation, and I'm sure so many women and potentially brothers as well will benefit from the knowledge that you've shared with us. Where can people find you and how can they work with you?
So you can find me on my YouTube channel. I'm sure Samaya will have this link. I sent some of the information. My YouTube channel is where the crux of my community is. I do Islamic self-improvement content, but I'm bringing in a lot more trauma-focused healing content in the coming months, inshallah, onto my channel. So you can subscribe there. If you want to follow me on Instagram or TikTok, I'm not as active on it. A lot more active on Instagram. My handles, I'm sure, will be below. If you are interested in actually working with me, I have two options. One is a trauma group coaching program, basically different cohorts. And so you have to apply either for the open cohort or you can apply for the waiting list. Don't be discouraged if you go to my website, which is my name, hana@osity.com. It'll hopefully be linked as well, or you can find it on my channel under any of the descriptions of any of my videos. If the waiting list is open, apply. Don't be discouraged. Those are the first women on the waiting list are going to be the first that get the notification that the cohort is open. So you'll be the first to know. So it's advantageous to actually do it. And that's for women, Muslim women only, who are truly ready and dedicated and ready to invest in their trauma healing. I'm very selective of who I work with because it's a very small cohort. If you want to work one-on-one with me, you just want a single session, maybe to pick my brain about certain things that I talk about on my channel. You want to work out a plan. I have a different system for my one-on-ones. Go to my website. Those are basically open on a rolling basis as well. I do not do full-blown trauma coaching one-on-one. There's a little bit of a line I draw there for different reasons. So if it has to be kind of a hyper focus, but just apply and show. I will get back to you immediately. I'm very good about getting back to my emails. If you'd like to work with me specifically, I'm more than happy, inshallah, to help serve you guys in whatever way that I can. Otherwise, there's plenty of free content that I put out there for anyone who wants to benefit.
Alhamdulillah, may Allah increase you and keep on blessing the work that you do and reward you in this life and in the next. Allahumma ameen. Thank you so much, Hannah.